She thought she had won. That was the thing she carried for 8 years, the specific, settled conviction of someone who has competed at the highest available level for 31 years and knows from the inside what winning feels like. She had felt it in the private training hall in Seoul on a Wednesday afternoon in November of 1972. She had felt it clearly, unmistakably, with the certainty of a woman who had felt it 89 times before and had learned across those 89 occasions to trust the feeling completely. She was wrong, but she didn't know that for 8 years. And when she found out in a small room in Busan in 1980, holding a notebook that had been brought to her by a student who didn't fully understand what he was carrying, she sat for a very long time without speaking. The student, who had known her for 6 years and had never once seen her express anything that could be described as vulnerability, said afterward that he had not known, watching her sit with the notebook, whether she was about to say something or whether the sitting itself was the response. Then she wept. Sun-Yi Choi had been practicing Hapkido since she was 12 years old, which meant that by the autumn of 1972, she had been practicing for 30 years, more than 3/4 of her life, and all of the part that she considered worth counting. Hapkido was not her discipline in the way that some people have a discipline, something studied, learned, acquired from outside, and made internal through repetition. It was hers in the more fundamental sense of something that had grown alongside her, that had been present in the formation of how she thought and how she moved, and how she understood the relationship between a body and the space it occupied. She had won 89 sanctioned matches across those 30 years, 0 losses. The record was not what she was most proud of. She had told interviewers this honestly, and they had written it down and then structured their pieces around the record anyway, because the record was the thing that was legible. What she was most proud of was considerably harder to describe, a quality of understanding that she had developed across 30 years of practice, about what happened at the precise intersection of two bodies in contact, that she had never fully been able to put into words, and had therefore never fully been able to teach, and that bothered her more than any aspect of her competitive record. She was 42 years old, and at the peak of whatever it was she had spent 30 years building, when the invitation arrived. The invitation came through a contact at the Korean Martial Arts Cultural Institute, a man named Park who had spent years building bridges between the Korean martial arts community and international practitioners, and who had reached out to her on behalf of a guest who was visiting Seoul and had expressed interest in working with Korean martial arts practitioners in a private context. No audience, no cameras, no formal structure, simply a private exchange, practitioner to practitioner, in the training space at the private club where Sun-Yi Choi spent her Tuesday and Wednesday mornings. The guest's name was Bruce Lee. Sun-Yi Choi had seen Enter the Dragon 4 months earlier, which had given her a technical impression of him that she held with the specific, calibrated skepticism of someone who had spent 30 years understanding what film showed and what it didn't. She thought he was gifted. She thought his physical capability was genuine, or more precisely, she thought the elements visible through a camera were genuine, and she understood from 30 years of practice how much of what was real couldn't be seen through a camera at all. She accepted the invitation because the question of what was actually there was to her a legitimate professional question, and the only honest way to answer a legitimate professional question was direct encounter. On a Wednesday morning in November of 1972, Bruce Lee arrived at the private club on the second floor of a building in the Jongno district of Seoul. Sun-Yi Choi was already there. The training space was small and wooden-floored and smelled of the specific combination of pine oil and old canvas that serious training spaces accumulate over years. There were no observers.
Park had arranged the meeting and then removed himself from it, understanding that the thing being requested was something that required the specific conditions of privacy, not secrecy, but the absence of an audience, the absence of anyone for whom a performance needed to be maintained. Sun-Yi Choi and Bruce Lee bowed. They stood across from each other for a moment. He said, in English, that she understood but found slightly formal, "I'd like to see what Hapkido actually is." She said, in Korean, that he followed with the specific, concentrated attention of someone parsing a language they have studied but don't fully speak. "Then let me show you." What followed for the next 45 minutes was the most unusual professional exchange of Sun-Yi Choi's 30-year career, and she did not understand why it was unusual until 8 years later. She showed him Hapkido, not the performance of it, not the demonstration version, but the actual thing, the joint locks, the redirection principles, the specific use of an opponent's committed force as the instrument of their own undoing. She applied these things to him directly, at real speed and real commitment, in the way she would have applied them to any serious opponent she was working with in a private context. And they worked. That was the thing. Every technique she applied produced the result it was designed to produce. Every lock found the angle it needed. Every redirection used the force he provided and sent it where it needed to go. He moved, fell, was displaced, was controlled with the complete real physicality of someone genuinely receiving what was being applied, not performing the receiving for a camera. At the end of 45 minutes, she had applied every significant principle in her vocabulary. She had demonstrated at full speed and with a serious and cooperative partner the full range of what 30 years of practice had produced. He had not once tried to counter anything. This was the thing she noted, filed, and, she would understand later, fundamentally misread. He had not tried to counter anything. He had moved when she moved him, been displaced when she displaced him, accepted the locks and redirections with the responsive physicality of someone who had no answer for what was being applied. She understood this in the moment as a form of confirmation of what she had been professional enough to come here to honestly test, that the quality visible through a camera was genuine, and that his capabilities in the real conditions of a private exchange with a serious practitioner were significant but not unmeasurable. She understood it, in other words, as a form of winning.
Not victory over an opponent. She was too serious for that framing, and he had not been trying to oppose her, but the professional confirmation that what she brought to the exchange was real in the way it needed to be real, and that the question she had come to answer had been answered. They bowed at the end. He said something she remembered later as brief and warm, something about the quality of what she had shown him, expressed with the specific quality of someone who meant what they said, but was not performing the meaning. She said something professionally appropriate in return. They parted. She told no one about the session for 8 years. Not because it had been a secret exactly. Park knew it had happened, and presumably Bruce Lee's people knew it had happened, and the club's caretaker had been in the building. But it had been private in the specific sense that what happened inside it was not intended for an audience, and Sun-Yi Choi had a strong and consistent instinct developed across 30 years of practicing something that was frequently misunderstood in public contexts, that the things most worth knowing were usually the things least suited to being described. She held the Wednesday morning in the way that significant things get held, as a complete, self-contained piece of experience, finished and certain, not requiring additional information or revision. In 1975, Bruce Lee had been dead for 2 years. The films continued to circulate, the conversations about him continued in the martial arts community, the specific, serious conversations that practitioners have about serious practitioners, different in texture from the public conversations, more precise, more willing to acknowledge complexity.
Sun-Yi Choi participated in these conversations when they arose, which was not often, and when they did, she said what she had concluded, that he had been genuine, that the gap between his film work and his actual capability had been smaller than most people assumed, that she had worked with him privately and found him serious. She did not say more than this because she believed she had said the relevant things. In the spring of 1980, a student of hers named Ji-ho, 24 years old, serious enough that he had been training with her for 6 years, with the specific quality of attention that she had identified early as the marker of someone who would eventually understand what they were practicing, came to her with a notebook. Ji-ho had been doing research on Jeet Kune Do. He had come across the notebook through a researcher in Hong Kong who had been cataloging materials from Bruce Lee's estate. The notebook was one of several training journals from 1972 and 1973. It had been photocopied and shared, carefully and selectively, among people the researcher considered serious enough to receive it. Ji-ho brought it to Sun-Yi Choi because there was a section in it dated November of 1972, a section that began with the words Wednesday, Seoul, Jongno. He put it in front of her and pointed to the page. Sun-Yi Choi read it. Bruce Lee had written about the Wednesday session in detail. He had written about each technique she had applied, described with a precision that told her reading that he had understood every one of them at a level that she would have been satisfied to find in a student of 10 years. He had written about the principles underlying the techniques, not just what they did, but why they worked, what they were actually reaching for beneath the surface of the movement. And then she reached the passage that stopped her. He had written in the middle of a longer reflection on the session, she applied everything correctly, every lock, every redirection, every displacement. She was 30 years in the room, and it showed. I let all of it land because the only honest way to receive something real is to receive it completely. But I was reading the whole time. I was reading the angles she loaded before each lock. I was reading the breath before each redirection. I was learning the whole session, and she never once tried to read me because she didn't need to. She was 30 years in. She knew exactly what she was doing.
He had written, "What I learned in 45 minutes in Seoul is still sitting with me." He had written, "She thought she was teaching me." She was. She just didn't know what she was teaching. Sun-Yi Choi read this passage twice. She set the notebook down. She sat very still for a long time. Seen her in competition, in private practice, in the moments of genuine difficulty that serious training always eventually produces. He had never seen anything on her face that resembled what he saw in the moment she set the notebook down. She was not angry. She was not embarrassed. She was not the various things that people sometimes are when they discover that a professional assessment they carried confidently for 8 years had been incomplete in a way they hadn't known. She was, and Ji-ho searched for years afterward for the precise word, asking others who had known her what word they would use, and most of them eventually settled on the same one. She was seen. She had spent 45 minutes 8 years ago in a small training hall in Seoul, believing she was demonstrating something to someone who was receiving it. And what the notebook told her, what Bruce Lee had written in the careful, specific language of someone who was genuinely serious about what he was doing, was that the receiving had been the active part, that the demonstration had been received by someone who was doing something considerably more complex than accepting what was offered, that the 45 minutes had not been what she had understood them to be. She wept. Not from regret. She was too serious for regret to be the correct frame. She wept from the specific, overwhelming quality of encountering, 8 years later, the honest record of something that had happened, the full record, not the partial version she had been carrying, and discovering that it was larger than she had known. She said to Ji-ho when she finally spoke, "He was reading the whole session." Ji-ho said, "Yes." She said, "And I never knew." Ji-ho said nothing. She said, 31 years,
89 matches. I have never once in this training room with any student or any serious practitioner had someone in front of me who was doing what he was doing and not shown me any part of it. She picked up the notebook again. She read the last line of the passage one more time. She set it down. She said, "He was the most honest person I ever worked with. He received everything I gave him completely, and he never showed me one thing he was doing." She paused. She said, "That is the most serious thing anyone has ever done with me in a training room." She trained for 4 more years. She retired in 1984 with 93 wins and 0 losses. In her retirement, she restructured the way she taught, introduced for the first time in 30 years of teaching a sustained focus on what she called receiving, the quality of attention you brought to an exchange not as the one doing, but as the one being done to. She said she had learned this from a Wednesday morning in 1980 in Busan, reading someone else's notes about a Wednesday morning 8 years earlier in Seoul. Her students noticed the change. Several of them became, in the years following her retirement, the most precise practitioners she had ever produced. One of them asked in a much later interview what Sun-Yi Choi had taught him that no one else had. She had told him that the most dangerous person in any exchange was not the one doing the most, it was the one reading the most. He said she had told him she had learned this from a notebook. He said she had never told him whose notebook it was. She had kept that part, he said, for herself. If this story reminded you that the most important education often happens when you think you are the teacher, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. Subscribe for more stories about the man behind the legend. Because Bruce Lee never wasted a single exchange, not even the ones where he said nothing, did nothing, and let someone spend 45 minutes believing they had shown him everything. He was reading the whole time.